On the morning of March 17, 1983, Victor Harlow sat in his kitchen in Alexandria, Virginia, listening to his wife pour coffee into a ceramic cup, and heard something else entirely. Through the static hum of the surveillance equipment hidden in the walls of their own home, he heard voices he recognized. CIA voices, his colleagues, men he trusted. And they were speaking about his wife with a coldness that made his blood stop. They were building a file. They were planting evidence. They were preparing to destroy her. And in that moment, Victor understood three things with absolute clarity. First, that his marriage had been a target all along. Second, that someone inside the agency knew he would be listening. And third, that whoever orchestrated this wanted him to hear it, wanted him to react, wanted him to break protocol and run. Because the trap wasn't just for her, it was for both of them. And the bait was the only thing Victor Harlow had ever loved more than his country. The Cold War was not fought with tanks rolling through the streets of Washington or Moscow. It was fought in shadows, in encrypted cables. In the silence between heartbeats when a man had to decide whether to believe his government or his gut. By 1983, the world had lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation for nearly 4 decades. The Soviet Union and the United States faced each other across an invisible line that ran through the center of Europe, through the center of the world, through the center of every soul forced to choose a side. The KGB and the CIA had become mirrors of each other, twin machines designed to protect their nations by destroying trust, by turning neighbor against neighbor, husband against wife, agent against agent. Paranoia was not a symptom of the Cold War. It was the strategy. And in that world, Victor Harlow had been a perfect soldier. He had joined the CIA in 1968, recruited straight out of MIT, where he had studied cryptography and signal intelligence. The agency needed mathematicians, men who could think in patterns and probabilities, men who could break codes faster than the Soviets could create them. Victor had a gift for it. He could hear the structure beneath the noise, could find meaning in what others dismissed as static. By the mid-1970s, he was running intercept operations in West Berlin, monitoring Soviet communications from a bunker beneath the city, headphones clamped over his ears 16 hours a day, listening to Russian voices plan operations that would never happen because Victor heard them first. He saved lives he would never meet. He prevented incidents that would never make the news. And he did it all in silence, because that was the job. You listened. You reported. You did not ask questions. You did not seek credit. You certainly did not fall in love, but he did. Her name was Alina Volkov, and she was not supposed to exist in his world. She was a translator at the United Nations, born in Leningrad, but raised in Prague after her father. A low-level Soviet diplomat, defected to the West in 1956. Her family had been granted asylum, relocated, rebuilt. By the time Victor met her at a diplomatic reception in New York in 1977, she had spent more than 20 years as an American resident, spoke 4 languages fluently, and carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from surviving the unthinkable. She had a laugh that sounded like forgiveness. And when she looked at him across a room full of people pretending to enjoy bad wine and worse conversation, Victor felt something he had trained himself never to feel: hope. They married in 1978, a small ceremony with fewer than a dozen guests. Most of them people Victor did not know and would never see again. The agency vetted her, of course. They vetted everyone. Elena passed every test. Her background was clean. Her defection story checked out. Her years in the West were documented, cross-referenced, verified. She had no contact with Soviet agents, no suspicious travel, no unexplained income. She was, by every measurable standard, exactly who she claimed to be. A woman who had escaped the Soviet Union as a child and wanted nothing more than to live a quiet life in a country that did not monitor her every breath. Victor believed it because the evidence supported it, and because he wanted to. For 5 years they built something that resembled a normal life. A townhouse in Alexandria with a small garden where Alina grew tomatoes and basil. Weekend drives to the Shenandoah Valley where they would hike in silence, both of them grateful for the absence of listening devices, the absence of suspicion. They did not talk about his work. He could not. She did not ask. That was the agreement. And it worked because they trusted each other in the one way that mattered. They trusted each other to keep their secrets separate, to love each other despite the walls they could not breach. It was not perfect, but it was theirs. Victor's work, meanwhile, had evolved. By 1982, he was no longer in the field. He had been promoted to a senior analyst position at Langley, running a team that monitored Soviet satellite communications and signals intelligence. The job was less glamorous, more bureaucratic, but the stakes were higher. The Reagan administration had escalated the arms race. The Soviets were paranoid, aggressive, unpredictable. Every intercepted transmission mattered. Every decoded message could mean the difference between containment and catastrophe. Victor worked 12-hour days, sometimes longer, sitting in a soundproof room with walls covered in maps and frequency charts, listening to the world prepare for a war that would end everything. And when he came home, he tried to forget. He tried to be a husband. He tried to pretend that the two parts of his life could coexist without colliding, but they couldn't. The first sign came in January 1983. A routine security review flagged an anomaly in Elena's background file. Nothing major. Just a discrepancy in the dates of her father's defection. A clerk noticed that Soviet records listed him as returning to Moscow in 1957, 1 year after he had supposedly fled to the West. It could have been a mistake. Soviet records were notoriously unreliable. But protocol required investigation. Victor was not told. That was standard procedure. You don't inform an agent when their spouse is under review. You watch, you wait. You build the case quietly so that if there is a problem, you can contain it before it spreads. Victor found out anyway. Because in February, someone made a mistake. Someone left a folder on a desk in an unsecured room. Someone let him see a surveillance log with his own address on it. Someone wanted him to know. At first, he told himself it was routine. Every CIA family was monitored to some degree. It was protection, not suspicion. But then he started noticing the details. The same sedan parked across the street 3 days in a row. A man in a gray coat who appeared at the grocery store every time Elena shopped. Phone calls that clicked just before the dial tone. And then, one night in early March, he came home to find the books on the shelf rearranged. Not dramatically, just slightly. Enough that someone who knew the order would notice. Enough that he would know someone had been inside. That was when Victor did something he had been trained never to do. He broke protocol. He installed his own surveillance equipment in his own home. It was not difficult. He had access to the technology. He knew how the systems worked. A miniature transmitter in the living room vent. A recorder in the basement. Nothing sophisticated. Just enough to hear what was happening in his house when he was not there. Just enough to confirm what he already suspected, that his home was no longer his own. That someone was listening, that someone was building a case, and that Elena had no idea. For 2 weeks he heard nothing unusual. Footsteps, doors closing. Elena on the phone with her sister, the hum of the refrigerator. The silence of a woman living alone with secrets she did not know she carried. And then, on the morning of March 17th, Victor heard something that changed everything. He was in the kitchen making coffee, preparing for another day at Langley. Elena was upstairs, getting ready for work. And through the static of his own hidden recorder, he heard voices. Not Elena's, not hers. Other voices, male, American, coming from the living room. He froze. The voices were calm, professional, methodical. They were not searching the house. They were not planting bugs. They were doing something worse. They were rehearsing. One voice he recognized immediately. Martin Cass, a senior operations officer Victor had worked with in Berlin. The other voice was younger, unfamiliar, but the tone was unmistakable. CIA. Cass was speaking in the flat, emotionless cadence of a man reading from a report. Subject is Elena Volkov-Harlow, age 38, born Leningrad, 1945. Father, Dmitry Volkov, listed as defector, 1956, except Soviet archives confirm he returned to Moscow in 1957 and worked for the KGB until his death in 1979, which means Elena Volkov's entire background is a fabrication. Which means she's been a sleeper agent for 26 years. Victor's hand stopped mid-air, the coffee pot suspended over the cup. The younger voice responded, "You think Harlow knows?" "No," Cass said, "but he will. That's the point. We let him find out. We let him hear this, and then we see what he does. If he runs, we know he's compromised. If he reports her, we know he's loyal. Either way, we get an answer. And if he does nothing, then we force his hand." Victor set the coffee pot down with a trembling hand. His mind was racing, sifting through scenarios, probabilities, outcomes. This was not a standard investigation. This was a setup. Someone had fed false information into Elena's file. Someone had staged this conversation knowing he would hear it. Someone wanted him to believe his wife was a Soviet agent, wanted him to panic, wanted him to make a mistake. But why? Who benefited from destroying him? Who wanted him out of the picture? And then it hit him. The answer was so obvious he almost laughed. Whoever was running this operation needed Victor Harlow to be compromised, needed him to be unreliable, needed him removed from his position. Because Victor had access to something they wanted, or because Victor knew something they needed buried. He thought back over the last 6 months, the projects he had worked on, the intercepts he had flagged, the reports he had written, and then he remembered December 1982, a Soviet transmission he had decoded. A conversation between 2 KGB officers stationed in Geneva. They were discussing a mole, an American asset. Someone inside the CIA feeding them intelligence on U.S. satellite operations. Victor had reported it. He had sent the transcript up the chain. And then ... nothing. No follow-up. No investigation. The report had disappeared into the bureaucracy like a stone dropped into a well. Now he understood. The mole was real. And the mole knew Victor had heard the conversation. So the mole did what any good intelligence officer would do. He created a distraction. He turned the spotlight onto Victor. He manufactured a crisis. He made Elena the threat, so that Victor would be too busy defending his wife to pursue the real enemy. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. And it was working. Victor stood in his kitchen, listening to his colleagues discuss his wife's execution, because that was what this would lead to. Arrest, trial, imprisonment, or worse, and realized he had 2 choices. He could follow protocol, report what he had heard, trust the system to investigate and clear Elena's name. Except the system was compromised. The mole was inside the system. If Victor reported this, he would be handing Elena directly to the people who wanted to destroy them both. Or he could do something the CIA had trained him never to do. He could trust his instincts over his orders. He could go off the grid. He could find the truth himself. Upstairs he heard Elena's footsteps. She was coming down for breakfast, unaware that her life had just been dismantled by men who had never met her, men who needed her to be guilty so they could stay hidden. Victor poured 2 cups of coffee and made his decision. He would not let them take her. He would not let them win. And if that meant turning against his own agency, against the institution he had served for 15 years, then so be it. Because love, in the end, was the only loyalty that mattered. And betrayal, he was learning, wore the uniform of patriots. Elena walked into the kitchen wearing a blue sweater and carrying a leather briefcase, her hair still damp from the shower. She smiled at Victor, that same smile that had made him believe in something beyond duty and secrecy, and took the coffee cup he offered. She did not notice that his hand was shaking. She did not see the weight in his eyes. She kissed him on the cheek and said something about a late meeting at the UN, something about translation work for a summit on grain exports. Details that Victor barely heard because his mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating risks, mapping escape routes, identifying who he could trust and who he couldn't. "Are you all right?" Elena asked, studying his face with the kind of attention that comes from years of reading people. Years of surviving by noticing what others missed. "Just tired," Victor said, forcing a smile that felt like a betrayal of its own. "Long week," she nodded, accepting the lie because she had learned not to press, had learned that his work came with silences she could not penetrate. She finished her coffee, kissed him again, and left for work. Victor watched through the window as she walked to her car. A modest sedan parked in the driveway and pulled away into the morning traffic. And for a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what would happen if he did nothing. The surveillance would continue. The evidence would accumulate, real or fabricated. Eventually, men in dark suits would arrive at their door. They would take her in for questioning. They would separate them. And Victor would never see her again. Not the way she was now. Not free. He could not let that happen. Victor went to the basement and retrieved the recording device he had hidden there. He played back the conversation he had overheard, listening again to Martin Cass and the younger officer rehearsing their script, confirming what he already knew. This was theater. This was a performance designed to manipulate him into a predictable response. But theater required an audience. And the audience, Victor realized, was not just him. Someone else was listening. Someone else was waiting to see what he would do. The mole, the real target. Victor's training kicked in. He started thinking like an intelligence officer, not a husband. If this was a trap, then the only way to survive was to spring it on his own terms. He needed information. He needed to know who had altered Elena's file, who had authorized the surveillance, who stood to gain from his destruction. And he needed to do it without alerting anyone at Langley that he was looking. There was only one person he could trust, maybe. David Klein had been Victor's mentor when he first joined the agency. An old-school officer who had run operations in Eastern Europe during the 1950s, back when espionage was still a gentleman's game and betrayal came with a handshake instead of a bullet. Klein had retired in 1980, forced out by a younger generation of bureaucrats who valued ideology over experience. But he still had contacts, still had access to the network of retired officers who remembered when loyalty meant something. If anyone could help Victor navigate this without triggering alarms, it was Klein. Victor called him from a payphone 3 blocks from his house, a precaution that felt both paranoid and necessary. Klein answered on the second ring, his voice rough with age and cigarettes. "Victor," Klein said, no surprise in his tone, as if he had been expecting the call. "I was wondering when you'd reach out." "You know," Victor said. "Not a question. I know enough. Your wife's file was flagged 6 weeks ago. Someone high up requested a full background review. Someone who doesn't usually involve themselves in routine vetting. Who?" There was a pause, the sound of Klein exhaling smoke. "Andrew Breslin." Victor's stomach dropped. Andrew Breslin was the deputy director of operations, one of the most powerful men in the CIA, a career officer with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and absolute loyalty to the institution. If Breslin was involved, this was not a rogue operation. This was sanctioned. This was policy. "Why?" Victor asked. "What does Breslin want with Elena?" "I don't think it's about her," Klein said quietly. "I think it's about you, about what you know, about what you might have heard. The Geneva intercept, so you did catch it." Klein sounded almost sad. "I thought you might have—" "That was a mistake, Victor. A mistake for you to have heard it, and a bigger mistake for you to have reported it. Because if there's a mole feeding the Soviets intelligence on satellite operations, and if that mole is someone Breslin wants to protect, then you're not investigating a traitor. You're threatening the structure." Victor leaned against the cold metal of the payphone, the weight of Klein's words settling over him like frost. "You're telling me Breslin is the mole? I'm telling you that in this business, loyalty and treason often wear the same face. And I'm telling you that if you go after Breslin, you won't just lose your career, you'll lose your life. And hers. So what do I do?" Klein was silent for a long moment. "Then, you disappear. Both of you. Tonight. Before they move on her. I can give you 48 hours, maybe less. After that, they'll know you ran, and they'll deploy resources you can't outmaneuver. But if you move now, if you're smart, you might make it out. Out where? Victor asked, though he already knew the answer. Anywhere that isn't here. Europe, maybe? South America, somewhere the agency can't easily reach. Somewhere you can regroup and decide what to do next. But you have to move now, Victor. Right now. Victor closed his eyes, feeling the cold air against his skin, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Running meant confirming their suspicions. It meant abandoning everything he had built, every principle he had served. It meant becoming the very thing they were accusing Elena of being, a traitor. But staying meant watching her die for a crime she did not commit. "I'll be in touch," Victor said, and hung up. He walked back to his house, moving carefully, checking for tails, for surveillance, for any sign that his call had been intercepted. The street was quiet. The gray sedan was gone. But that meant nothing. They could be watching from a dozen angles he couldn't see. They could already know what he was planning, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. Hesitation was how you got caught. Victor spent the rest of the morning preparing. He withdrew cash from 3 different ATMs, staying below the reporting threshold. He retrieved a go-bag he had kept hidden in the garage since his days in Berlin, a relic from a time when he believed he might need to run from the Soviets, never imagining he might need to run from his own side. The bag contained fake passports, prepaid credit cards under aliases, a handgun he had never fired, and $10,000 in unmarked bills. It was a paranoid precaution that now felt like prophecy. He called Elena at work from another payphone, keeping his voice steady, calm, unremarkable. "I need you to come home early," he said. "Family emergency. I'll explain when you get here." "Is everything all right?" she asked, and he could hear the worry in her voice, the instinct to protect him even when she didn't know from what. "Not over the phone. Just come home, please," she agreed. She always did. That was the tragedy of it. Her trust was absolute, even when his couldn't be. Victor returned to the house and waited. He sat in the living room where Cass and the younger officer had rehearsed their accusations, and he thought about the architecture of betrayal. How it was built in layers. How the people who created it often believed they were protecting something noble: national security, the greater good, the integrity of institutions that required lies to survive. How easy it was to justify cruelty when you wrapped it in patriotism. How the Cold War had turned everyone into both victim and executioner. How it had made moral clarity impossible because every choice led to someone's destruction. Elena arrived 40 minutes later. She walked through the door and stopped when she saw his face, saw the way he was sitting, saw the tension in his shoulders that he could no longer hide. "What's wrong?" she asked. Victor told her everything: the surveillance, the altered file, the accusation, the trap. He told her about the mole, about Breslin, about the Geneva intercept. He told her that someone inside the CIA was using her as a weapon against him, and that if they stayed, she would be arrested, interrogated, and disappeared into a system that did not care whether she was guilty or innocent, only whether she was useful as proof of Victor's unreliability. Elena listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each sentence. Her hands gripping the armrest of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "You believe me? That I'm not what they're saying?" "Yes," Victor said. "I know you're not." "How do you know?" "Because I know you." She smiled, but it was the saddest smile he had ever seen. "That's not evidence, Victor. That's faith. And faith doesn't hold up in interrogations. I don't care about interrogations. I care about keeping you alive. And what about you? If we run, they'll call you a traitor. They'll say you were compromised. They'll erase everything you've done. You'll lose everything you've worked for." "I already lost it," Victor said. "The moment Breslin decided to use you as bait. The agency I believed in doesn't exist. Maybe it never did. And I won't sacrifice you to protect an illusion." Elena stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street, at the ordinary suburban landscape that had become a battleground neither of them had chosen. Where would we go? I don't know yet. Somewhere outside their reach. Somewhere we can figure out what to do next. And if they find us, then we deal with it. Together. She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for certainty, for reassurance, for anything that might make this nightmare feel less real. And Victor, who had spent his entire career trafficking in deception, who had learned to read people by their lies, gave her the only truth he had left. I won't let them take you, he said, not without a fight. Alina nodded slowly, accepting the weight of what he was offering. What he was risking, what he was willing to destroy to protect her. And in that moment, Victor understood something fundamental about love and loyalty, about the difference between serving a country and serving a person. Countries demanded obedience. People required choice. And he had made his. They packed quickly, efficiently, taking only what they could carry. Clothes, documents, cash. Nothing sentimental, nothing that could slow them down. Victor disabled the surveillance equipment he had installed, erased the recordings, destroyed anything that could connect him to the evidence he had gathered. He left no trail, no proof, no explanation. When the agency came looking, and they would find an empty house and questions that had no answers. They left at dusk, driving south on I-95 in Elena's sedan, blending into the evening traffic, just another couple heading out of the city for the weekend. Victor watched the rearview mirror, checking for tails, for patterns, for anything that suggested they had been flagged. But the road behind them stayed clear. Either they had moved fast enough or the agency was letting them run, waiting to see where they would go, who they would contact, what mistakes they would make. Victor drove for 3 hours before stopping at a rest area in North Carolina. He used a payphone to call Klein one last time. "We're out," Victor said. "What now?" Klein's voice was heavy with something that sounded like regret. "Now you stay out. Don't contact anyone from your old life. Don't use your real names. Don't trust anyone who claims they can help. The agency will put out a bolo. They'll freeze your accounts. They'll monitor your friends, your family, anyone you've ever known. You're ghosts now, Victor, and ghosts don't get second chances. Did we ever have a first chance?" "No," Klein said quietly. "I don't think you did. This was always going to end badly. The only variable was how much you'd lose before it was over. And Breslin? Breslin will keep doing what he does, protecting his secrets, sacrificing whoever he needs to. Men like him don't lose, Victor. They just accumulate casualties." Victor hung up without saying goodbye. Goodbyes were for people who believed in reunions, in resolutions, in happy endings. And Victor Harlow no longer believed in any of those things. They drove through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee. Moving deeper into the American South, where the highways stretched empty and anonymous under a sky full of stars that didn't care about borders or ideologies or the small human dramas unfolding beneath them. Alina slept in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. Her breathing slow and steady, and Victor drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel, his mind replaying every decision that had led them here. He thought about the morning he had heard those voices in his living room, the moment he had realized his marriage was a weapon, the choice he had made to believe his wife over his government. And he wondered if that choice made him a traitor, or if it made him something else entirely, something the Cold War had no word for. Something that transcended the binary logic of loyalty and betrayal, east and west, us and them, something human. By dawn, they had reached a small town in Georgia. A place so unremarkable that Victor couldn't remember its name 5 minutes after driving through it. They checked into a motel under one of the aliases from his go-bag, paid in cash, and collapsed onto a bed that smelled like bleach and cigarette smoke. Elena woke briefly, long enough to look at him and ask, "Are we safe?" "For now," Victor said, though he didn't believe it. She fell back asleep, and Victor lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of trucks on the highway. And he thought about what Klein had said. That they were ghosts now. That the agency would erase them, hunt them, make them disappear. And he thought about all the other people the Cold War had erased. all the anonymous casualties of a conflict that had no front lines and no end. All the men and women who had been sacrificed to protect secrets that would never be revealed, to serve causes that had long since lost their meaning. He thought about the mole, about Andrew Breslin sitting in his office at Langley, drinking coffee, reviewing reports, making decisions that would destroy lives he would never see, would never acknowledge, would never mourn. And Victor understood that he was not fighting against the Soviet Union anymore. He was fighting against something worse, against the machinery of his own side, against the people who had convinced themselves that betrayal was patriotism, that loyalty required cruelty, that the ends justified any means as long as the means stayed classified. And he knew, with a certainty that felt like surrender, that he could not win. Not against Breslin, not against the agency, not against the architecture of power that had turned him into a fugitive for the crime of loving someone the system had decided was expendable. But he could survive. They could survive. And maybe, in some small way, that was its own form of resistance, to refuse to be erased, to refuse to disappear quietly, to keep living, keep moving, keep choosing each other over the machine that wanted to grind them down into nothing. The sun rose over Georgia, pale and indifferent, and Victor Harlow closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that when he woke, they would have to run again, knowing that they would always be running, knowing that the Cold War did not end with treaties or surrenders. It ended with exhaustion, with people too tired to fight, too broken to care, too defeated to remember what they had been fighting for in the first place. And somewhere, in a secure facility outside Washington, Andrew Breslin would read a report about two fugitives who had vanished without explanation. And he would make a note in a file and move on to the next problem, the next crisis, the next sacrifice the system required. Because that was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. The machine consumed people and called it security. It destroyed families and called it necessity. It created enemies and called it vigilance. And Victor Harlow, who had spent 15 years serving that machine, who had believed in its mission, who had sacrificed his youth and his innocence and his peace of mind to protect a country that no longer protected him, finally understood the truth that every spy eventually learns. There are no heroes in the Cold War. There are no villains. There are only people caught between two versions of the same lie, trying to survive long enough to tell the difference. And most of them never do. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile trust really was during those years, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten. Stories of people who loved the wrong person, believed the wrong thing, heard the wrong secret. Stories that ended in silence, in shadows, and unmarked graves. Stories that remind us that history is not made by nations. It is made by individuals who are forced to choose between loyalty and truth, between duty and love, between survival and surrender. And most of the time, there is no right choice. There is only the choice you can live with, or the choice you die with. Victor and Elena Harlow chose each other. And in doing so, they became ghosts. But they became ghosts together. And in the cold arithmetic of the Cold War, that might be the closest thing to victory anyone ever gets.